Why did the United States reach Silicon Valley?
Yep. That is, such an important question. The Valley thrived on diversity, cultural diversity. I think there's something about diversity that is significant for innovation. And it's, of course, it's a fragile thing. I always wonder when the Valley will be over. When will the next significant technical innovation come from someplace else than Silicon Valley? Reticent about betting against Silicon Valley, even though I expect at some point that there will be a major technological innovation in China or Japan or Europe that, will move the center of gravity, and that it just hasn't happened yet.
PIVOT の竹下です。今日はですね、ニューヨークタイムズの元記者で、シリコンバレーをもう1970年代から取材しているジョン・マルコフさんに話を聞きます。彼はですね、スチュワート・ブランドというもう本当に伝説的な人物の伝記をこの間書きまして、このことについて書きます。このスチュワート・ブランド、聞いたことある人もいるとは思うんですけれど、スティーブ・ジョブズの有名なStay hungry, stay foolish。本当にスタンフォードの大学の演説で有名な言葉ですけど、この Stay hungry, stay foolish という言葉を生み出した人物として知られていて、シリコンバレーのカルチャーの原点にいるような人です。今回その、スチュワート・ブランドに70回ぐらいのですね、インタビューを通して、この本を書いた、ジョン・マルコフさんに話を聞いて、シリコンバレーカルチャーの源流、そして今その源流となったカルチャーが、このオープン AI、この時代にですね、まだ残されているのかっていうことも含めて聞いていきたいと思います。では早速本人とつないでみたいと思います。So, hi, hello, John. Welcome to PIVOT.
Thank you. It's a treat to be here. I wish I was actually there in Japan. It would be better.
Have you been to Japan?
I have. I have a couple of times in reporting, but it's been a long time.
Reporting?
2 decades since I was in Japan. So, a lot's happened.
What was the topic about back then?
I was focused on communications technologies. I was there in 2000. I spent a week in Japan and a week in Beijing, actually. And I was looking at the competition then between Japan and the United States. And the internet was already a factor, but at that time it was very new in the world. And I was interested in how the internet was emerging, the commercial internet in Japan, which was brand new at that point. At that point, though, supercomputers were still a major factor, and the Japanese were a significant player. I visited Fujitsu when I was there. I visited Sony. I remember visiting a man by the name of Kei Nishi, who'd had a big influence on the computing world. So it was fascinating for me, and I would like to come again.
Yeah, we should come here again. Okay, so let's talk about your new book, The Whole Earth, about Stuart Brand, who created the Whole Earth catalog. And I'll start the question by asking, why did you write the book about Stuart Brand? Because you are the former New York Times reporter covering tech, and surprised that you have been covering Silicon Valley since 1977. And, Stuart Brand is also famous in Japan for his mantra, stay hungry, stay foolish, which Steve Jobs cited. So first question, what did you decide to write about a book about Stuart Brand?
Yeah, I'm about a decade younger than Stuart. And so I was growing up, I grew up in Palo Alto, which is, of course, became the heart of Silicon Valley before it was Silicon Valley. And so I saw many of the things that Stuart saw very early on, I came to afterwards. And so I was interested in his life story. He touched on many of the things, both technological and cultural and social, that I was interested in. And it also was a window for me to try to understand. The book, in some ways, is a reinterpretation of the counterculture, and it's a reinterpretation of Stuart's relationship to many of the technological things that happened early on in Silicon Valley. And so I've thought of myself as a historian of Silicon Valley, and I wanted to see where Stuart fit. And this was a good opportunity to do that.
So you conducted 70 personal interviews with Stuart. So what kind of person is he, in your impression?
Stuart is cerebral. He's now in his early 80s. I met him first many years before that, while I was, long before I was a reporter at the New York Times. We both were people who early on were attracted and were involved in the personal computer industry, which began in the 1970s and really took off in the early 1980s. And so I'd seen him over the years. I mean, I had actually read the Whole Earth catalog when I was young. I was influenced by the same kind of countercultural things that he literally created. And all of that sort of played into a personality that I'd known for some years. I think that Stuart's interesting in that he's extremely intellectual, but it's very difficult to put him in a box. It's fashionable to say this person is a conservative, this person is a liberal, this person is, pro-technology, anti-technology. And Stuart sort of, he fits outside the box on many, many things. And in those conversations, I'd written earlier books, but every time before, I took leave from my job and I had to rush back to work. So I wrote those books very quickly. There was no time pressure. And so we got into this pattern where I was reading his papers that he'd given to Stanford. And I'd spend a week reading his papers, and then I'd go up to Sausalito where he lived, and we'd talk about them every week. And I began to, he felt a little bit like the older brother I never had. He's about a decade older than me. The conversations were wide open and very easy. He's not many people think of Stuart as being standoffish. He's a little bit, I think they confuse that. There's a shyness about him, but he opens up, and he's most of all, he's one of the best read people I've ever met in my life. He's read everything. And I think that's sort of at the heart of Stuart. He grew up in a house full of books, and he's continued. He now has two homes. One is in Sausalito, which is right on the edge of the San Francisco Bay. And then there's a small farm that he has about 10 miles to the north. And they converted a barn into a library there. And it's a beautiful library of about 5,000 or more volumes. And when he gave me a tour of the library, I realized he'd read everything in that library, which was very impressive. And it's a very wide range and a set of interests. So I think that's a little bit of, he was in the Army in the 1960s.
Right.
Has a little bit of that background. That shapes you when you do something like that when you're that young. And he was deeply involved in the counterculture, and he's still very sympathetic with that perspective. So, an interesting person.
Interesting. So, could you explain to our audience and pivot to the Japanese audience what counterculture was like in the 1960s, 1970s? Because this Whole Earth catalog was first published in 1968. And could you explain to us and walk us through what was counterculture like and how that connected to the technology culture?
Yeah, the American counterculture emerged, and actually it was not just America. In the mid to late 60s, there was a youth movement that spread all over the world, but it really sort of began and was centered on the Mid-Peninsula in San Francisco. And, strikingly, at the same time that the forces that created Silicon Valley were happening, and not many people understand that. But the counterculture, you have to put it in the context of, to understand it, you have to put it in the context of what was happening in America in the 1950s. In the wake of the World War II, American society developed, a middle class emerged, the economy was growing and booming, and people were largely, the society was relatively homogeneous. American society was. And I think in the middle of the 1960s, many of the young people who were in college, young people just getting out of high school, felt locked into that society, and they were trying to break out of a society that was forcing them into particular career choices. And at the same time, there were a number of societal forces taking place. There was a war in Vietnam that created this opposition movement. There was a civil rights movement in the 60s that had disaffected many of the young people. That realized America was not the equal society that it was supposed to be. And then in the 70s, a drug culture emerged. People began experimenting with marijuana, with psychedelic drugs, and you throw all that together. And in San Francisco, in the 60s, there was a group of people who called themselves hippies. That was the urban component of the counterculture. At the same time, in periods 66 to 69, 70, literally hundreds of thousands or millions of young Americans decided they wanted to go back to the land, it was called. They wanted a more rural lifestyle. They wanted to live outside of the urban area. And both of those things were happening at the same time, coupled with this particular kind of music that emerged in San Francisco, represented by bands like the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane. And you threw all that together and you got a culture that was in some ways in reaction to the 1950s middle class American culture. And it had this significant impact on the entire world. And Stewart was right in the middle of that.
So you're right that it was kind of not happening only in the United States, but maybe also in Japan, Europe. A lot of young people went into the streets to protest, and also respect for non-Western culture or indigenous culture. Question is, why that lead to a technology culture? Creating Steve Jobs and Apple and that. Why did the counterculture movement lead to that?
That's interesting. So the counterculture had several facets, and one of that facet, one part of the counterculture was anti-technological. There was this rejection, a kind of corporate computing world represented by mainframe computers. But that wasn't the entirety of it. And Brand represented this other side of the counterculture that was what you call it the pro-technology, utopian, about the impact of technology. America had been very influenced in the 1960s by science fiction. And there was this positive view towards spaceflight. And we really thought that there were technological solutions to social problems. And that was not all of the counterculture was opposed to technology. And the best example of that was the Whole Earth Catalog. I mean, the Whole Earth Catalog was subtitled Access to Tools. And yes. Brand was very influenced in the 1960s by two figures. One, Buckminster Fuller, the guy who's known for the geodesic dome. Mm-hmm. And Fuller's idea was, if you wanted to change the way somebody thinks, you didn't try to persuade them. You simply gave them a tool and taught them how to learn the tool, and that would change the way they thought. And that was very influential on Brand. And he was also much more influenced than I originally realized by a man by the name of Douglas Engelbart. And Engelbart was a computer scientist at a laboratory, a government-funded laboratory largely called Stanford Research Institute. And Engelbart was the guy who invented all the technologies that would become personal computing and the internet. I mean, many of the technology, I know all is probably too strong, but everything from hypertext to interactive computing began in Doug Engelbart's lab in the 1960s. And Stewart was very early to observe that. And so those two forces were very much more part of the counterculture than we tend to think. And Stewart represented them.
Interesting, because a lot of business media in Japan talk about why there is no Silicon Valley in Japan. And I'm curious that in Japan, there were also counter movements and people went down to streets, but that kind of led to people lost decades of politics, and people chose to stay away from politics because that movement was so impactful in the society. So why did the United States were able to Silicon Valley?
Yep. That is, I mean, such an important question, and it's very controversial. Lots of people have different opinions. Right. I'll give you mine. I grew up in this area that became Silicon Valley, and so I watched this happen. What I think, and in the 1980s, when I first started working as a young reporter, and Silicon Valley had already become this popular place, I would see different delegations come from all over the world regularly, and they want to take back whatever the magic was in Silicon Valley so they could create a Silicon Mountain or a Silicon Desert. And it didn't take. So here's my sense of what set the Valley in motion and what made it this innovative center and has continued to make it this innovation center. And that is that the Valley thrived on diversity, cultural diversity, both in terms of different cultures from around the world and also different cultures, like even within the American context. There, even so, at the very beginning of Silicon Valley, if you were around areas in the South, like Mountain View, where the semiconductor companies were, or Sunnyvale, the culture was aerospace engineering, and the people would wear white shirts and they would have pocket protectors and they were engineers and they would carry slide rules. But if you went up to Stanford, it was much more of a long-haired, hippie kind of, and these were computer hackers, the early computer hackers. And both of those were two cultures. Now, when the Valley took off, it became a magnet for people from all over the world. And it was very open to those people. And you still see that. So the first time I realized that something interesting was afoot was in 1984. I was at Byte Magazine. I was a technical editor. And there was this new thing called the disk drive industry. And a friend of mine took me to Sunnyvale, and we went to a bakery that was a bakery for Indians from India, because the disk drive industry was hiring the best and brightest from IIT, and they were coming with their families and living, and they were bringing their culture with them. And, Fremont ultimately became a largely Indian city. Cupertino is largely a Chinese city. There are many pockets, and they all live in relative harmony. And the Valley has continued to be this magnet. The Chinese came in great numbers, the Japanese came in great numbers, and they coexisted. And I think there's something about diversity that is significant for innovation. And it's, of course, it's a fragile thing. Yes. If we limit immigration in America, like many people want to, then people may not come here, and will undercut what we created.
Do you think Silicon Valley has changed, especially the modern technology culture? The tech culture has changed since Stuart Brand was around, or how do you see the current Silicon Valley culture?
So people say, oh, Elon Musk or Zuckerberg, or, they pick on individuals. But if you look at the Valley as a whole, it really is important to realize that there is a diversity of cultures, and that's its strength. So Elon Musk is very visible, and he's very loud, and he owns Twitter, and so he has this megaphone that's one of the most powerful things in the world. But I don't think, to your point about has the culture changed, I do think that there was a significant. So at the beginning, one of the things that sparked the technological innovation was this combination of, let's take Apple, for example. Mm-hmm. Apple, its two founders, Jobs and Wozniak. Yes. Wozniak built his first computer not to sell as a product, but simply to share with his friends at the homebrew computer company. He had no intention of starting a company. He was interested in computing in its own end. It was Steve Jobs who understood there might be a market for a personal computer. And I think it was that blend of those two approaches that made the Valley what it was. And you could find that all over the place early on. Now, in the late 1980s, I think the ballot shifted from this balance of fascination with technology and desire for profit, and it dialed its way because of the dot-com explosion of wealth. I mean, John Doerr, who was an early technologist in the Valley and a venture capitalist, referred to first the personal computer industry and then the internet as the largest legal accumulation of wealth in history. And I think that did change the culture. At Stanford in the late 1980s, this group emerged called the PayPal Mafia. Yes. And I think that was not a hacker culture. That was a profit culture. And I think it's much more influential. Musk was part of that profit culture. He's not principally a technologist, even though he asserts that he is. He's a businessman. Yes. And so I think you're right that the Valley has changed. And yet, if you look around the Valley, you will still find those original hacking cultures to be thriving. I think the switch to generative AI as the latest sort of phenomenon to come from the Valley is really a technological phenomenon that's very interesting, and it's sort of it resonates with many of the early things that happened in Silicon Valley.
Interesting. It's interesting you mentioned about generative AI. Do you feel that suppose OpenAI has that kind of hacking culture, and also culture of Stuart Brand, which you described in your book? It's kind of like respecting individuals, techno optimism, and respect for science. Do you feel that in OpenAI and generative AI?
First, let me a caveat. I covered the artificial intelligence world from actually when I first started in the 1970s up through 2016 when I retired from the New York Times and I went into the library. And so I feel a little bit like Rip Van Winkle. it's been 2 to 3 generations of AI technology since I left. But I was involved. I was at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, so I've stayed in touch a little bit. I haven't done the kind of on-the-ground reporting that you really have to do to understand these things. But I think that there's really interesting cultural stuff afoot in OpenAI and Inflection and Anthropic. It's not just OpenAI. There are a number of very interesting AI-oriented startups that have that hacker culture in some way at the heart. Now, it's gotten very interesting. In 2011, there was a fascinating book written by a professor of religion called Apocalyptic AI. Robert Gerasi wrote it, and it was focused on the ideas of people like Raymond Kurzweil, who was an early AI developer, Hans Moravec, who came out of Silicon Valley, and both Moravec and Kurzweil believed in this idea of the singularity. The technology was accelerating, and that soon we would have machines that were more intelligent than humans, and that raised all kinds of sort of deeply existential questions. Mm-hmm. And so all that's playing out now because the machines increasingly give the appearance that they are stepping close to being, conscious, sentient things. There's a huge debate about, what's actually going on. Nobody really completely understands the mechanism of these systems. I think I'm more in the skeptical camp that they're tremendously impressive technologies, but they are not equivalent to human consciousness or sentience at this point. But it's done exactly what you're suggesting. It's the Valley went off in this social media direction. It's beginning in 2011, and now the swing back to AI, I think, is in some ways a step back to the roots of the Valley into a pure technology notion, and it's driving the current wave of investment in the Valley in interesting ways.
I agree because in 2010s, I used to be in Stanford. I spent Stanford a year, but I felt that the Valley was changing to a very business-oriented culture. But after OpenAI, I think it's going back to the original. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I was. They have these things called unconferences, which are conferences that sort of self-assemble. And one of the technologists who's developing one of the language models, a man by the name of Richard Socher, had this conference during the summer, and he brought together about 180 young technologists mostly, and it was the closest I've been to sort of understanding what's going on. They were talking about business ideas with this technology and the impact of the technology on society. And I was really struck at how similar this period feels to the dot-com era in Silicon Valley. It was 23 years ago when it was spun up. Actually going back to 1995 when the dot-com era started, but it felt very similar. There were lots of bright young people who believed that they had ideas that would change the world. And that's, I always wonder when the Valley will be over, because nothing lasts forever, right? And when will the next significant technical innovation come from someplace else than Silicon Valley? And, many times, like in 2005, I was spending a lot of time in Europe, and it felt like the center of mobile innovation had moved to Europe. There was Nokia, there was Symbian, mobile applications were coming quicker there. And then in 2007, the iPhone showed up and the center of innovation shifted back to Silicon Valley. So I'm reticent about betting against Silicon Valley, even though I expect at some point that there will be a major technological innovation in China or Japan or Europe that, will move the center of gravity, and that it just hasn't happened yet.
Do you think that will happen in the near future? I'm
almost certain it will happen at some point. First of all, the internet has changed the rules of engagement because it's really leveled the playing ground. I mean, you can start a company anywhere in the world and have access to all the knowledge and all the people. And so that's changed the equation in ways that I don't think we completely understand yet. So I think it's quite possible. I keep looking to China. I was in China last in 2016, 2017, right when their entrepreneurial explosion was in full. And it really struck me. I was in Beijing in the third ring, and I felt like I was right in the middle of Silicon Valley. I mean, except that it was like 100 times as large. There were millions of people with ideas. And then she closed it all down. And so the question is that I would love to go back to China to explore this. Can a non-democratic society be as innovative as a democratic society? And China is a great test of whether, and I don't know the answer. I mean, I know Kai-Fu Lee, the Chinese AI expert, and Kai-Fu, really believes that China is going to be the dominant power in AI in the world. And we'll just have to see. It's an interesting competition, but now, there's interesting innovation. I know it's happening in Japan. I know it's happening in Europe. I don't think it's guaranteed where the next significant innovation will come from.
So, yeah, you're right that theoretically speaking, you can start a company anywhere you want. And, Valley is a special place, but it's basically a land with it's a normal city, So my question is that, so you mentioned that can China be as the next Silicon Valley, even if it's not a democratic country? And by reading your book, I have the notion that in order to create innovation, you need more than technology, like music, culture, and everything around California. Do you think that's an important factor other than democracy?
Absolutely. I mean, I wrote an earlier book, which in some ways, this is the Brand's biography is a sequel. I was trying to understand what created the Valley and what created the personal computer industry. And I wrote a book called What the Dormouse Said. I didn't completely understand it at the time, but afterwards, I ran into some social scientists from the Santa Fe Institute. And their argument is creativity happens on the edge of chaos. And we looked at what I was reporting in Silicon Valley at that time, or this was 65 to 75, so that was the birth of Silicon Valley. You had these 3 computer laboratories. You had Xerox PARC, you had Stanford Research Institute, and you had the Stanford AI Laboratory. And all around them was this chaotic political and cultural civil rights turmoil. All this crazy stuff was going on. And it exactly fits the model that they were on the edge of chaos, and the young people who were working there were in this environment. And I don't believe technological innovation happens in a vacuum, that it is culturally determined and it's affected by the particular culture that it exists in. And we should mention, China, Japan, Europe, and also India. I think India is a wild card. I know an Indian computer scientist who was teaching in the United States, and he has a big idea in quantum computing, and he moved to Hyderabad to start his company there because he had access to great mathematicians at very low cost. And so maybe that's where, if quantum computing is the next big thing, maybe it will come from India.
Interesting. So let's go back to the topic about whole earth catalog. So the mantra, stay hungry, stay foolish, it's very also famous in Japan. So what do you think Stuart Brand meant that?
Yes.
What was the intention? Yeah.
I actually asked him, so I have a very good sense of that. So the stay hungry, stay foolish was the inside cover of one of the last Whole Earth catalogs. And it was paired with a picture. It's kind of it's not a sad picture, but it's a picture just of a California highway going off into the distance. Brand was trying to capture the idea of a young hitchhiker standing by the side of the road, heading off to somewhere in the world to some adventure that was completely unplanned. And that was the idea of stay hungry, stay foolish. Keep your mind open to possibilities and explore and have adventures. That was very much a part of the worldview of the young people at that time, and it affected people like Steve Jobs. I can't tell you how many people I ran into who, when I told them, people of my age largely, who said, I ran across some idea or something in the Whole Earth catalog that sent my life in an entire different direction. It was this was before Google, before the internet, before the easy access to information. When I was growing up, there was the library, there was the bookstore, and that was about it. And you had to go to these places. It wasn't, in the palm of your hand. And so the role that the catalog played was this kind of serendipity engine to new ideas. And people would find things that were interesting and they would go off and pursue them. And that was at the heart of that stay hungry, stay foolish view of the world, if you will.
So do you think the whole Earth catalog, so do you think Google or social media is equivalent to the whole Earth catalog at this time?
Equivalent is hard to say. Once again, we're in an information-rich world. We were in an information-expensive world back then. And so it's very hard to compare. It's so easy to follow any interest you have in the world now. And we're just moving. I mean, it's very clear to me what the language models, what the chatbots are going to do is they're going to change the way we search for information yet again. In the past you Googled. I think it's likely in the future you'll have a conversation. And the conversation will be as open and interesting as you want it to be. And so it's hard to pin it down because it's just changing. I mean, I was very influenced. When Steve Jobs left Apple in the 1980s, John Sculley really didn't have the same kind of vision. And so he turned to Alan Kay, and a group around people around Alan Kay came up with this video that was called Knowledge Navigator. And you can still see Knowledge Navigator on the web. And it was this vision of the future of computing where you'd have this intelligent assistant that would help you with all of your knowledge needs. And it was very compelling. And it actually led directly to Siri. The two designers of Siri were inspired by Knowledge Navigator. And now with the development of language models, we're right on the cusp of being able to build that. Now, it's going to have this interesting effect on society that I don't think we fully understand. I mean, in 2015, I wrote about a Microsoft experiment in China called Xiaoice. And Xiaoice, or Little Bing, was this conversational system before language models, and it developed this intense audience, more than 20 million young people who had these deep conversations. I don't know if the movie Her came to Japan.
Yes.
It is a model of this new world that computers have mastered language, and that's just happened in the last year. And I think that the sociological and economic consequences of that they're totally up in the air, and we don't know what will happen yet.
Have you heard a conversation with Stuart about search engines or AI or social media?
We certainly talked about Google. We haven't talked as much about language models. Are very new. I finished the book in 2021, and they were just sort of starting to have an impact. I know he uses them. I know he's optimistic about them. I don't know how deeply he's explored them at this point.
Okay, so about the whole Earth catalog, and so the picture is very impressive of the whole Earth on the cover. So what kind of impact did that cover have to the society and the tech culture in America?
I think that's one of Stuart Brand's most significant contributions, and I think it's why he's still relevant today. He had this experience that's sort of legendary. He was experimenting with LSD in the 1960s. And one day his father had cancer, and he was thinking about his father, and he went up on the roof of his apartment in San Francisco, and he had taken half a tab of LSD, and he basically, in his mind, he floated up above the world. This is 1966. And he suddenly realized that he was, in his mind's eye, he was seeing the whole Earth. And he realized that even though satellites had been around since 1957, there was no photograph of the whole Earth. And so he came back down off the roof, and he started this campaign. He wandered around the country going to different college campuses selling this button. Why haven't we seen a photograph of the whole Earth yet?
Yes.
It was kind of a profound question. And then when he started this catalog in a name, he called it the Whole Earth Catalog. But the significance in terms of the cultural shift that happened between the 50s and 60s, what was the symbol that was sort of the defining symbol of the 1950s? It was the mushroom cloud. It was a very dark view of the future of humanity. What happened in the 60s and 70s is the mushroom cloud was replaced by this picture of the whole Earth. And if you think about it, if you think about symbols, every symbol I can think of except for the whole Earth divides us as a species. I mean, whether it's your football team or your country, it divides us. The whole Earth is the one sort of symbol that brings us together as a species. And I think Stuart saw that early on. He realized that, his sort of as an individual and as an activist and as a thinker, his idea was the responsibility that we had to our species and to the planet, to the entire ecosystem. And that's been the through line through his entire life. And that notion of a planetary consciousness seems like something that we could really we're in this period where nationalism is resurgent. There's wars. A planetary consciousness would be a really good thing right now, I think.
Right, I agree. Also, what's Stuart doing right now? I've heard reports that he's trying to build a clock that will keep time for.
Oh, yes. Two things. First, the clock, and he's writing a book right now. When I started my book, it was because he had been thinking about an autobiography. He decided he was too old. He didn't have as much energy. He was glad that I was doing it. Then he got re-energized, and he's writing a book about the sort of the impact of maintenance on human society, which sounds like a very dull topic, but it's up on the internet. You can find it. He's doing it in a very modern way. He's writing the book and putting each chapter up so people can read them and comment on them. So it's there. But the clock idea is very interesting because it started just at the dawn of the dot-com era. He was friends with a man by the name of Danny Hillis, who was a computer scientist who was building one of the first parallel supercomputers. And Danny became alarmed about what was going on in American society at that point in time. We were thinking about the world in ever shorter, quarterly, minute-by-minute kind of things. And he wanted people to think long-term. And so he thought about what would be a way to make people think more long-term about the future of humanity. And he came up with the idea of building this mechanical clock that was built in such a way that it would run for 10,000 years. Wow. And he took people like me out and explained this idea, and I just didn't get it. He sent out an email to 30 of his friends, and the only person who responded was Stuart. And Stuart said, if you're going to build a clock, you need a library, because the library represented the culture and the continuity of information and knowledge. Oh. And so they started on this clock project, and it bubbled for many years. And then ultimately they had the good fortune of Jeff Bezos decided he liked the idea. Yeah. So over the last half decade, the clock project's been around since the mid 1990s, but just in the last half year, they've begun building the clock. It's located in a 6,000-foot mountain on Jeff Bezos' spaceport. It's almost finished. And whatever you think of the idea, because it's kind of a crazy idea, it's going to be one of the wonders of the world. It is held in a 500-foot deep stone cavern that they hollowed out, and there's a staircase all the way around it. The clock keeps time by itself because of its design. But in order to make it tell time, you have to wind it. It's very much like a traditional clock. It only rings every year, once a year, and every century a cuckoo will come out. So it's and it's completely mechanical. There's nothing electronic in it, and it's almost finished. And it's going to be something that people will be able to make pilgrimages to. And I think
it will be open to the public so we can see it.
You're going to have to walk to it. There'll be. You can already see some pictures and videos that have sort of appeared, but you'll have to make this pilgrimage, and you go to the bottom and you have to walk up the staircase. I haven't seen the top, so I don't know what it's going to look like, the actual display of the clock. But it really is quite impressive. And so Stuart was involved in building that institution, that organization. The office is in San Francisco, but the clock itself, the first model of the clock is in Texas.
And in addition to the clock, he's trying to extinct animals. He's trying to revive.
Yes. That was a project that spun off of the clock organization, and it's called now. There's a nonprofit organization called Revive and Restore, and Revive is very controversial. The notion of bringing back the woolly mammoth has been hotly debated about whether we should spend our time. But the restore part, I think, is also very significant because many of the ecosystems that humans live in are under great stress because of climate and industrialization and other things. And the idea is that, we are as gods. The humans can actively, with thought, restore some of the ecosystems we've destroyed. And that's going on in many places. There's a really interesting project in San Francisco. One of the, it's not just the woolly mammoth. Many creatures, I think hundreds of species go extinct every year. And there was a beautiful butterfly called the xerces that went extinct because of urbanization in San Francisco in the 1940s. And scientists are working in the Presidio, which is a national park in San Francisco, to try to recreate the ecosystem and then use modern genetic engineering techniques to actually rebuild this butterfly and see if they can get it to become part of the world again. And I think that's a very significant idea. I mean, there's that science fiction novel about the idea that the wing of a butterfly can lead to a tornado or a hurricane.
Uh-huh.
So there's some symbolism there.
Yeah, like the butterfly effect. Yes.
Yeah, the butterfly effect. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I think, John, we need to wrap up. Any final comments or anything to add we haven't discussed?
No, I think I just say that Stuart made a number of trips to Japan, and he as an individual, he was fascinated by Japanese culture and Japanese design and aesthetics, and it was one of the important things that influenced him. And he was looking forward to coming back. Actually, we were invited by Joichi Ito to speak, and that didn't happen. So maybe at some point we will be able to.
Okay, thank you, John. Thank you for your time, and I hope our audience will love your book, Whole Earth Gala. Yes, thank you so much.
Thanks for taking time with me, Ryan.
Yes.
Good to Bye bye.
PIVOT では新たなメンバーの募集を始めました。ビジネスプロデュース、エンジニア、コーポレート、映像制作など積極的に採用しています。ご応募はこちらのリンク、または概要欄の URL からお願いします。日本をピボットするコンテンツを一緒に作りましょう。